Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of our Unmasked series. My name is Afeni Grace, and I am the program coordinator for the Harvey B. Gantt Center. This evening, we hear the voices of major corporate and nonprofit leaders in our city for a deeper understanding of how these increased investments have influenced our community and what they mean for underserved communities of color. But before we get started, please be sure to click the like button and also click the subscribe button below the screen to be updated on all future Gantt Center programs. Also, be sure to visit our website, ganttcenter.org, for updates on all Gantt Center programs, exhibits, and initiatives. We do currently have linked in our YouTube chat a 2-minute audience survey. If you haven't completed the survey, please take the time to do so now to contribute to the conversation. Also, please feel free to use that YouTube chat for any questions or comments that you have throughout the evening. We will address any audience questions as well as the survey results in the second half of the program. So now it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's moderator, Erin Barbie. A native Charlottean, Erin Barbie is an executive operations professional with over 13 years of experience in the management of varying levels of senior housing. As the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Housing Partnership's Senior Vice President of Programs and Fund Development, she is responsible for overseeing the programs that impact economic mobility of the clients served. This includes the financial literacy program, digital literacy program, home buyer education, fundraising, community engagement, and management of the House Charlotte program for the city of Charlotte. Hi, Erin, how are you this evening?
Doing very well, Ebony. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that warm introduction. Tonight, I am honored to be moderating a panel of esteemed people who are focused on investing in the Black community. Before we jump into questions, I would like to read a brief bio about each panelist as they join us. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Ebony Thomas. Ebony is the Senior Vice President, Environmental, Social, and Governance and Public Policy Executive for Bank of America. Ebony Thomas is the Racial Equality and Economic Opportunity Initiatives Executive responsible for delivering Bank of America's $1 billion four-year initiative to accelerate work and help drive racial equality and economic opportunity for people and communities of color. She works to identify and build partnerships with internal and external community leaders, business leaders, local elected officials, and others in the communities we serve to drive economic opportunity and upward mobility through programmatic initiatives. Ebony, thank you for joining us. Next, we have Brian Collier. Brian is the Executive Vice President for Foundation of the Carolinas, which is the 6th largest community foundation in the United States with over $2.7 billion in assets. Brian oversees the foundation's competitive grants program, as well as affiliate board relationships in 13 counties throughout North and South Carolina. He also oversees the foundation's Robinson Center for Civic Leadership and the development of community initiatives, including Charlotte Bridge Home, Project Lift, Carolina Thread Trail, and the multi-year initiative identifying and implementing community strategies addressing upward mobility and economic opportunity, and that's leading on opportunity. Brian is also currently leading the efforts for $20 million to help individuals and families impacted by the COVID-19 crisis. Brian, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And last but certainly not least, we have Federico Rios, the Assistant Director for the Office of Equity, Mobility, and Immigrant Integration for the City of Charlotte. Federico manages the city's efforts in diversity, equity and inclusion, economic mobility, and immigrant integration, and he's charged with helping to eliminate systemic barriers. Prior to joining the city, he spent 8.5 years with communities and schools for Charlotte-Mecklenburg. As the founding director of the Newcomer Services Program, Federico, in partnership with Charlotte-Mecklenburg Schools, created a case management model to serve newly arrived and highly often traumatized Central American youth. His commitment to service is driven by his desire to see all of our community members have equitable access to opportunities. Federico, welcome.
Thank you.
So this evening, our topic is how we are investing in Black communities. And we want to dig deep into that topic. But first, I want to kick it off with a question for our panelists. We're going to start with you, Ebony, answering it, followed by Brian and then Federico. But the question is, how has the year 2020 changed how your organizations invest in local community? Ebony?
So Aaron, thank you for the question, and thank you for having me. I'm excited to be a part of such a great group of panelists tonight. 2020 has been a couple of things. It's brought great opportunity for some. It's brought highlight and a microscope for many issues that, quite honestly, we have known about. But it's created the spotlight in which you can't deny and which you can't hide from. And I think that's when I talk about the opportunity. And I think in a lot of ways, for many organizations, and no similar to Bank of America or similar to Bank of America, it's been a huge stress test. And it's really been about, how do you respond to that stress? What do you do in those moments of crisis? And not just about your community, but the people that you employ, your colleagues that you work with, who essentially live within the community that you represent and you serve. And so I think we have come through in a number of ways in support of our community, and also the people who are our teammates every day, whether that's through expanding our childcare options, right? We recognize that there is a large percentage of the US population that can't work from home, that don't have the access and the resources to be able to work from home. And so you need to be able to then provide the support to your employees or to your community to help balance that out. So providing a number of options for our teammates to be able to have extending childcare options. And not only just childcare, but when you're taking care of elderly family members, children with special needs. I mean, the extension of these needs are far reaching than just parents, but all kinds of caregivers. So I think the role that we played in supporting our community and our employees through caregivers, the support that we provided, and just the new definition of what flexibility means. I think there was maybe one before, it's very different now.
Yes.
And I think that you can't undo that. That will continue on for many seasons to come. And I think the way that we quite honestly invested in our community, which I know we'll get to in a little bit, is the commitment that we've made. We talk a little bit about the microscope that this year has brought forth in terms of racial inequality and the racial unrest that was really magnified by that of the virus. And you can't undo that. You can't unsee it. And so now it is clear for all of us to bear witness to. And as you bear witness to, you have to then take action. And so that action for us has manifested itself through work. It's manifested itself through a financial commitment of $1 billion to across not only this community, but 90 other communities across the US. And so what we've seen then is a number of private sectors, private companies who've also come to the table to say, we have resources that we want to help drive solutions. So there are a number of ways in which companies have risen to the stress and quite honestly have done incredibly well. And I'm proud to say that the bank has done well on both accounts, not only to its teammates and its 200,000 plus employees across the country, but also into the 91 markets and the communities that we serve across the US and globally.
Thank you so much, Ebony. Something I pulled from what you just said is has been a stress test for all of us, right? I have that image of what a stress test means, and it has just not stopped for us. And also to have that flexibility. So thank you, and thank you to Bank of America's commitment. So Brian, turning it over to you, how has the year 2020 changed how your organization, the foundation, invests in its local community?
Thank you, Erin. It's always great to talk with you. And so first of all, it's interesting when I know almost page by page the Opportunity Task Force report that we released in 2017. And back then, I insisted that we put in a quote from a book I was reading at the time. It was talking about the American system and kind of looking at it and kind of trying to put it into context of reality, because there's this dream, there's this myth of the American dream, and then there's the reality of how that actually plays out day to day for people. And one of the quotes that was in the book said that the American system creates this uneasy tension where because our safety net is so thin, that people are forced to make decisions in their lives that go against their basic values or their beliefs, because we're all scared. You know, we're all worried about tomorrow we won't have health care. Our parents will enter a system where elder care doesn't exist, and child care, and all of these things create this immense stress on us. And I think when I wrote that, I was talking when I put that quote in, I was thinking more in generalities, and certainly specifically about children and their ability to live the American dream. But I think this year has really exposed that situation more proximately for people than I could have ever imagined. I think now this year has really told people that what we believed about our country and our how we invest in one another, I think this year has really exposed that communities of color certainly have had disparities in the way that the COVID virus has hit their communities. And the safety net that we had around healthcare and other things just isn't up to the challenge that we've had this year. So that's one thing where in many ways it just put into sort of this stark sense of terms that these things that we kind of were believing even before this year, but this year really just brought that all to the front. But I think from your question about how have we changed investments, one of the things that I've learned a great deal about this year that I am embarrassed in a way to say is the great work that many of our small organizations are doing out in the communities, our grassroots organizations. And I say that because we were, this year we had the community responded generously for the COVID response fund. We've raised almost $20 million. And I think when I went into that, I thought that the majority of that money would go to the larger institutions, the big housing organizations, the big workforce organizations, the big food organizations. And it certainly, those organizations have done a good job this year. But I think the thing that I learned that would just kind of hit me was oftentimes those organizations didn't have the nimbleness or the flexibility to go where the people were, to go out and really see people, knock on doors, ensure that groups that even weren't used to getting social services before, there are many groups that just weren't used to going to a crisis assistance ministry or to other places. Maybe that wasn't their culture. And then they needed people who looked like them, spoke their language, whatever it was, to go to them and offer help. And so that was my big awakening this year was, I knew the small organizations existed, certainly, but I did not know, I couldn't find the pathway for a large foundation to get engaged with them. And I have certainly overcome that this year. I mean, I don't know where our community would be without those grassroots and small organizations. And I hope when we get on the other side of this crisis, that one of the things we don't do is forget about the great things that they did. And we need to figure out a way to help them scale up and continue to do that good work. So for me this year, the biggest learning was something that was right in front of my face the whole time, which is the good work that grassroots organizations are doing. And there's lots of other lessons that I've learned. This is certainly a humbling year for philanthropy, but that's the most vivid for me.
That's interesting that you said that, Brian. I was just, as I was listening to your comments about the thin safety net, and then you talk about our grassroots organizations really being the ones that carried us through just step by step COVID, that's a different kind of safety net, right? So maybe we're just starting to shift our thinking about what safety nets look like. That just kind of became very present for me. So thank you for that. Shifting to you, Federico. How has the year 2020 changed in your organization, which is the City of Charlotte, how they invest in local community?
Well, Erin, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with you. It's always an honor, and my fellow panelists as well. The city has really dramatically changed the way we're looking at, one, how we do our work. So how do we really look at the investments that we've made historically in community, and if nothing else, I know this, I'm echoing some of what's already been said, we're recognizing that we have left people behind. There are groups of individuals, there are communities that make up Charlotte that have been left behind. And that comes from a funding standpoint, from an access to services and resources standpoint. And so we've really shifted and focused our attention. And this is pre-COVID, I would say, you know, and I know we'll talk a bit about my office, but the city manager and the mayor and council have really been intent on ensuring that we as a city are an equitable city, a city that access to service is really primary. And so we have really dedicated ourselves to doing that, but COVID has shown this light on where we are as a community, and the fact that so many of the things that we have done historically have led us to a path where people cannot easily get to what they need in a moment. Case in point, I know for us, when we think about how we've done things differently, I've been promoting a language access plan, a citywide language access plan with the city since coming on board. A city of this size with close to 17 to 18% of its population being foreign born, not having a language access plan is fairly noteworthy. And it was really COVID that, you know, led this thing to move even faster, because there was this recognition that there were whole pockets of our community that were not able to access information that was of vital importance for their health and safety. And so I would say that we've pivoted a great deal, and we've really concentrated on how do we serve those individuals, those community members, our residents that have historically had challenges in accessing what we offer.
Thank you, Federico. We're going to stick with you for just a moment and dig just a little bit deeper. You talked with us a moment ago about the language access program that you were implementing, but let's talk a little bit about your role itself. It's fairly new in the city of Charlotte. What's the history behind its creation?
Yeah, thank you for that. So when I first came on the city 3 years ago, I joined initially as the Immigrant Integration Manager for the city of Charlotte. In July of 2019, the role shifted to incorporate some other areas of work that were intersectional, and there was a recognition again by the manager and council of its interdependence. And so my role can be broken up into three parts. I am tasked as the city's equity officer to lead our efforts around diversity, equity, and inclusion with our workforce. We have approximately 8,000 individuals that make up that workforce. And so I'm really tasked to work alongside departments as an advisor to figure out what are the challenges that those individual departments face. And those look vastly different. So if you're working in aviation, that looks completely different from an equity issue with solid waste. At the same time, there's a recognition that across the board, there's some equity work that needs to occur. In addition to that, I am tasked with leading our economic, and that, let me go back for a second, that diversity, equity, and inclusion work is really directed by a report that came out in 2019, our diversity, equity, and inclusion assessment was done internally with the city of Charlotte. Our economic mobility work is really directed by the Leading on Opportunity report that has been referenced earlier. So the Leading on Opportunity report really directs our work around how we as a community, how we as a city really work alongside community to ensure that economic mobility can be had by our residents. So a lot of that work as of now has been tasked around community safety, ensuring that not only are we a safe community, but we're a community that works together to address our safety concerns, recognizing that individuals at the community level have the solutions for the challenges that they face. It's a matter of ensuring that we're most appropriate in those individuals and organizations. Lastly, the third bucket that my work falls into is the immigrant integration bucket. So this is really ensuring that all of our residents, again, that 17 to 18% of individuals that are foreign born, but have that access to the resources and services we provide, ensuring that those individuals are not left behind in conversations that are occurring in this community, but are centralized and focused, and that their needs are being addressed by the services we render.
Just by the fact that the city of Charlotte has invested in a position like this speaks volumes, right? That shows that their commitment to the people and to equity. I want to talk about a specific program really quickly. What investment is specifically happening related to the Safe Charlotte plan? Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I'd love to. The Safe Charlotte plan, actually unanimously approved by City Council in October, really details recommendations that came from a community input group that was gathered throughout the summer that I had the honor and distinction to serve as the staff resource for. So just quickly, there's 6 recommendations. One is to expand our community policing model, develop a non-sworn officer emergency responder model for mental health crises, work with CMPD and an outside assessor to develop recommendations to convert low-risk sworn duties to non-uniform units, engaging a consultant to do a full external analysis of policing, partnering with a university or independent organization to evaluate youth programs on an annual basis. So again, these are youth programs that are done through the police department, enhancing our recruitment efforts and developing a program to provide additional residency initiatives or incentives to our police officers. And then lastly, all of that takes money, but this last piece actually speaks to something Brian referred to in regards to grassroots organizations. The city manager recognized that we're not going to do this alone. We have to partner with the grassroots groups that have dedicated themselves to addressing community safety. And so we have proposed, the recommendation has been put forward and agreed to by council to provide $1 million from our current budget to help Charlotte-based nonprofits address those concerns, to give them the ability to provide for their infrastructure needs so that they can do the good work that we recognize would address our underlying community safety challenges.
A direct $1 million investment into these smaller organizations that are doing the work. I'm excited to hear more about that, but I do have to move on. So I'm going to switch over to Brian. Thank you, Federico, for that. Brian, after the murder of George Floyd, in addition to issuing a statement supporting racial equity, the Foundation for the Carolinas mentioned creating educational programming on race and equity issues. Can you explain what this programming looks like? And have you seen any shifts in how fund holders have invested their money as a result?
Yeah, I think the thing that I'm proudest of our work so far. So we did put out the statement, which I know a lot of organizations did that, but we were very deliberate about ensuring that we not only put out a statement but also back that up with some type of action to sort of demonstrate our commitment. And the thing I'm most proud of is the investment that we're making internally, because I think the one thing that philanthropy can be very guilty of is going out and telling others how they should do. Here's money to do this because this is the way we believe you should do this. And in fact, maybe we'll get to this, but that's actually what kind of led me to the opportunity work in the first place, because I just kind of became a little pessimistic and cynical about philanthropy. But so what we've decided to do is we're going to work on ourselves first in many ways on this. And so we've had Race Matters. We've been working intentionally with them over the last several months to have Derek come in and help our staff talk to one another, share stories and beliefs and values, and get to know one another, and have frank conversations about this. The other thing that we've also done internally is we gave all of our staff members $500 for them to go and take that in any amount that they want to give to organizations that are working in the racial equity space. So they can pick an organization in Charlotte, they can pick an organization anywhere. And what we hope to do is to learn what our staff members believe are valuable and maybe incorporate that into our grant making. So if they found an organization that we hadn't worked with in the past, that might be one that we lift up and try to figure out how to work with in the future. So the things we did, first of all, we've brought in people to help us. Secondly, we've allowed our staff to make investments. And then the third thing, which is more direct to the question you asked, is how do we educate the fund holders? Because at the end of the day, we are almost a $3 billion organization. We are the 6th largest community foundation in the country, and we have a good deal of influence, and our donors have the capacity to make significant investments in the community. So what we're doing is we're starting to do a series of educational sessions with them to help bring them along with the learnings that we are finding here in the community. So again, bringing in Race Matters and other groups to talk to them, and to sort of also help define some terms, because now there's a real intentional movement around Black-led or Black-serving organizations. What does that mean? What does that look like? How do we define it? And helping our donors understand how their investments make a big difference in the community, not just the organizations that they put their money into, but who leads those organizations, who informs the work of those organizations, ensuring that they are, to the best of our capacity, doing the work that the community itself wants, and again, to the best of our capacity, ensuring that the leadership can look like those who they're working with. So I think this year, it's, again, I think I said this a few minutes ago, it's a very humbling year. It's one that reminds you that no matter what philanthropy says it's doing, and no matter how much money we invest, we have a long way to go. We have a lot of learning to do, and quite frankly, we have a lot of listening to do. So we're on a journey, and I think most of it right now is listening to our community and trying to be thoughtful about response rather than knee-jerk, just this is what we're going to do.
Brian, I'm really encouraged by how you started this conversation by basically saying it starts at home, right? I like the investment that you're making internally with your organization to make sure you're walking the walk and talking the talk, right? Not just pushing it out into community and saying, here's what you have to do. Brian, thank you so much. I'm going to turn the conversation over to Ebony. And Ebony, wow, Bank of America made a bold commitment over 4 years to invest $1 billion to accelerate and drive racial equity. What percentage of Bank of America's $1 billion investment will be allocated to Charlotte?
So Erin, thanks for the question. It's so the way that we think about the 1 billion is, and the difference between us and maybe other organizations, is that I think I heard the word earlier from Brian about being proximate to issues. And the way that we think about it is we have 92 markets across the US. And the way part of the funding will be allocated down to those 92 markets, because they are proximate, similar to Brian and Federico, they are proximate to their community. They understand what the unique needs are from St. Louis to LA to Atlanta to Miami. And so each one of those markets has market leadership, a market president, which really leads off and faces off with constituents within the community. And so that allocation will be brought down amongst those markets. So Charlotte, being one of our 92 markets, there will be an allocation that will come down to that market. And the way that we think about it, it's data driven. We're a bank. And so like everyone else, we really focus on the data and what's the story. And so we've really taken a data driven approach to the strategy of the allocation. What's the unemployment rate? What's the poverty rate in that particular city? What's the demographics of that particular city? The 1 billion has, in many ways, a racial lens to it. So it's focused on Hispanic and Latino communities. And so when we take all those elements, all those data elements to understand the uniqueness of a particular market, we deck that or stack that against the allocation that ultimately will be brought down to the market. So that means that the resources of those markets and those cities that need the most, Charlotte being one of them among many cities across the country, that's how we think about the allocations for the 1 billion.
And you mentioned it was going to be data driven. So talk to us a little bit about how that data driven and data informed process works with the current initiatives within the Black community and to influence your goals for this investment.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think Brian and Federico talked about it a lot, which I so appreciate, because it really is about grassroots, right? We think about some of the large organizations or non-for-profits that have been around for quite some time. And I think that work will really continue. But we do have a lot of modern and contemporary grassroots organizations who are rolling up their sleeves and are doing amazing work that for a lot of reasons have been underfunded or under the radar. And so this is the opportunity for those markets to uncover those grassroots organizations, those organizations that are rolling up their sleeves and focused on the communities, whether it be in Rhode Island, Dallas, Fort Worth, here in Charlotte, right? And so that's going to be really important. And so it's going to be data driven from our community, right? What
Mhm.
are the needs of our community? Not all communities are the same. And so we can't take a single approach to how we deploy these resources. It really has to be about what are the needs and the uniqueness of that particular community. That gives us some autonomy to think about what is unique and different in Charlotte. The leading on opportunity work, which I know Brian and Federico are really tied into, and we are tied into at the bank as well. It's really, what are those really opportunities for us to double down on and really make some long-term strategic investments and really moving the needle in some of those initiatives and work. So it's data that's driven from our community. It may be data that's driven from the state and level. It could be things that are coming down at the national level as well, that we are able to pull together that can really tell a story. And then using internal resources, external voices and influencers that help us shape what the impact is that we're trying to achieve. And do we have the right metrics and goals to actually meet those, and the right metrics to actually meet those goals?
Yeah, and what I hear you saying is it's data driven, but you're also working alongside the community to ensure that these goals are met. Truly appreciate that.
Yeah, the data
So
is just one element of it, but people,
yes,
people really drive the excitement, the passion, and we can't, we can't use data as the single source in which we do this work. It is a piece, but it's people like Brian, like Federico, and the many organizations that we'll work with that will help influence what it will actually look like. So it is a combination of both our people, our community, our stakeholders, as well as the data.
and we look forward to seeing this come to fruition. Thank you, Ebony. We're going to pause for just a moment from our panel discussion, because earlier in the conversation, we told you about a survey that we are putting out. So I'm going to turn it to Afeni to give us those survey results, and we'll be right back with you.
Thank you, Erin. So yes, we are going to pivot for a moment and discuss the results of the audience survey. Please keep in mind that these results are only based on our audience members who completed the survey. So our first question is, prior to tonight's conversation, how aware were you of the various investments in Charlotte's Black community? As you can see here, we have 28.6% of surveyors who selected that they were not at all aware of those investments, 57% who selected that they were slightly aware, and about 14% who selected that they were somewhat aware. So none who were moderately or very aware of the various investments in our community. Our next question was, where do you think community investment should be most focused? An overwhelming majority of about 57% of surveyors selected that housing should get the most investments. And our surveyors, about 14.3% equally selected education, health, and jobs and employment. Our next question was, what issues are you most concerned about related to these types of investments? Overwhelming majority of about 71% of surveyors selected that it's the sustainability of both resources and development that they're most concerned about. And 14.3% selected relevance of objectives to the community, as well as exploitation of the community. Our next question was, what is the best way to ensure the community needs are best reflected during goal planning and funding of these investments? So we have about half and half. 57% of surveyors selected that community forums would best help to ensure that the community's needs are best reflected. And about 43% selected that advisory boards would be best for this. And our final question was an open-ended question. And it asked, what long-term effects do you hope will be the result of investments in the Black community? And our surveyors gave responses such as upward mobility, equity among everyone in our city, and someone also said stable, affordable housing and reduce homelessness. So Erin, based on these survey responses, was there something that stood out to you or to our panelists?
Thank you so much, Ebony, for that. And thank you to those that participated in that survey. You know, as I was looking back at the questions, I was jotting down some notes here, but I hate for question number one, that we didn't have any participants to indicate that they felt moderately aware or very aware of the resources and investments in Charlotte's Black community. That tells me we have a very specific opportunity to change that narrative. If we have these resources available, but people don't actually know how to access them, then what is the point, honestly? And so I would hope that we could come out of today with a commitment to be able to focus on how we communicate that message to our community. That's what stood out most for me. I'm going to start with you, Brian, and then to Federico and Ebony. Did anything stand out for you with the survey results? You might be on mute. There you are.
All right, there we go. Yeah, I guess, several things stood out. One was like you, and again, this is probably less on the person's responsibility to know about all the investments and more on the community of philanthropy and the city and others in the corporate sector to tell people about what we're doing. Because, a lot of times we're like, well, you should have known this and you should have known that. Well, as people try to lead their lives on a day-to-day basis, they're not always going to read a press release from the bank or from the foundation. So we need to do a better job of telling our story, because I think a lot of times people have this sense of despair that no one cares about them, or that, the worst thing that so the best thing I've done in maybe in my recent career, and the worst thing was talking about the 50th of 50 study that was done by Raj Shetty. The greatest thing about that was it galvanized community spirit around, hey, we have to do something about this. The worst thing that I did when we really promoted that was it led people to believe that Charlotte is a bad place to live, that it is the worst place to live. And that is not the case. Many people move to this community because of the belief of opportunity, and this is a place that has abundant resources, but we don't equitably share them. That is one thing we need to work on in the future. And we are segregated, so people don't see one another, they don't know one another, and the resources aren't allocated, in a way in which people maybe the fairest way of doing that. So I think we need to work on that. But I think the one thing that the survey really highlights to me is we need to tell a better story about what we're doing and how that can lead our community forward. And the other thing that I'm really excited about in this survey is the belief that the best way to get more information is to get out in the community through these community forums. Don't rely on advisory boards necessarily. To some degree, you always need people who can commit time and have wisdom and things like that. But they want us to come out into the community and talk to them more, which is something that I loved. We did a lot of that in the task force work, where we went out, tried out ideas, listened to them, and then kind of fed them back into the overall process. So to me, the other thing that I think is abundantly clear is this idea that housing is important, and it's become worse in our community. We need to address that. But the only other thing that stuck out to me from the survey results that I'd like to see the community aim a little higher on was, I heard one person said, what does all this investment look like ultimately? And their opinion was safe, affordable housing. I agree with that, but that is an end to what I believe, a means to what I believe is the ultimate end for our community, which is I want Charlotte to be the greatest place in the world for a child to be born and raised, and for them to seek out what they believe is their higher calling in life, whatever that is. And I want them to have this sense of freedom and independence to go pursue that. So housing is a piece of it, education is a piece of it, healthcare is a piece of it, but it's all part of a bigger system that I would love us to aim higher and really have this vision that we don't want to just be a place with great housing. We want to be a place that was a springboard to this bigger opportunity in life.
Thank you so much, Brian. Federico, your thoughts and feedback from the survey.
Yeah, so Brian has said a great deal of what I was thinking. I would add to what he said, this idea of telling better stories, we have to figure out a new method to get those stories across. I think there was a time in my life where I watched the 11 o'clock news fairly regularly to get information, or I picked up the newspaper and looked through it. That's not this day and age. And so we have to modernize our communication vehicles how it is that we get the information out to individuals. We do have to spend more time in community getting the word out and letting it naturally seed from person to person. But we got to figure out the methodology we're going to implement this. And this is not just the nonprofit sector issue, the bank issue, or the city issue. This is across the board how we share pertinent information to the communities that make up this city. The other piece that stood out was the chart, right? So the chart, the pie graph, when it did this focus on affordable housing. Again, I'm echoing some of what Brian's already said. I think what stood out to me was the intersectionality of all those things, right? So we have the jobs issues because we have an education issue. This community still has a great deal of third graders not reading at grade level. And that permeates throughout the life of an individual. And then, we have so much of the affordable housing issue is a lack of good jobs or jobs that pay a living wage. So how do we anticipate individuals being able to afford rent, a mortgage in this community, unless they're paid closer to what they're worth? We're never paid what we're worth, but closer to at least the living wage. And so those are the things that stood out to me. I would say too that, even thinking about how we're going about this conversation, are we focusing enough on the individuals that would never come to these talks? Are we focusing enough on the individuals that are just surviving or are preoccupied with every other aspect of their lives and can't set aside the time to have these discussions or hear from individuals that have connections and the ability to provide, whatever that is that they have? I don't think we are. And I don't know that any community has really done a great job of doing this, but can we take a different approach? Can we begin to go door to door? Obviously not during COVID, but can we spend more time interfacing with one another in spite of our segregation, in spite of our limitations? Can we ensure that we're having human connection between each other?
Federico, even though COVID has brought us further apart physically, it does feel like there's an appetite for innovation and how we connect with one another. And this is an opportunity for us to do a better job of identifying, to your point, the folks that wouldn't come to a talk like this today and being able to get this investment information out. I think that that the community wants that, and I hope that we can innovate in that space. So Ebony, turning over to you, what are your thoughts and reactions from the survey?
So at the risk of not repeating my colleagues who had such amazing comments, I will add two things. We have to meet people where they are. We operate with this notion that it's FYI. It's not like casually for your information, kind of you should know. They have a right to know, and it's our job to figure out the vehicles and the ways in which they have access to this information. I mean, I look at the stats every single day around home ownership, the stats around the number of businesses that fail. And since we are specifically talking about, Black individuals and Black entrepreneurs, the number of Black businesses that have failed during this period that won't return. And let's be clear, it's not because they weren't viable. It's not because they weren't smart and intelligent. It was because they did not have the same access to information that everyone else had. The same, the basic information of like, where do I go? And why is that? Like, it can't be this conversation that we're continuously having. It's like, well, we don't know. We gotta have conversations. We gotta meet people where we are. We have to stop. That includes all of us, because we're all operating from a position of privilege at this point. But we all have to think about what is that thread, that link that is absolutely missing, that these communities are not getting this information. And it can't be like just haphazardly, maybe you should know. It should be some systems that create that are direct vehicles and a confirmation almost that you have this in hand. And then what then you do with it. I mean, we talk about to our people all the time in a corporate environment that we may give information to or give messages to. And what do? We repeat them over and over and over and over again. That's the same thing within this community. And to Federico's point, I do subscribe to every newspaper out there and, watch the 11 o'clock news, the 5, the 6, and all of that. And I watch these channels and I read this news and I don't see these headlines. I don't see, the news coming with, this is how you apply for PPE. I don't see the news saying this is how you get this loan, right? I think there are ways in which we are missing opportunities to get folks this information that they desperately need. The other point I think that is connected to what Federico and Brian also talked about is the housing piece, which is fascinating to me. But what I see too is there was a Brookings report that came out maybe about 2 weeks ago on the social network within Charlotte. I connect directly social network to housing. That this whole segregation issue around housing is it about housing? Yes, but it's also about the deep segregation that still exists within this city. And within the South, this is really not about Charlotte, to Brian's point. I grew up in Iredell County, went to school here in North Carolina, lived in a number of cities across the US and come back to Charlotte and live in a community too that's, deeply segregated. And then my social network reflects that segregation. And so when you talk about housing, right, it's also about what do the social networks look like? How do we break those barriers within Charlotte of those networks? And then I think you can see much more of a divided pie between maybe housing, jobs, business and the such. But at least what I see there is that deep divide of the social networks in Charlotte, which, are very clearly drawn. And so I think that we have to, create ways to break those barriers too, to not have people climb hurdles that here's the community in which I sit, here's the housing that I aspire to have, right? I'm aspirational in my housing. And yet that dream that Brian talked about earlier is just that. It's fleeting. When I wake up in the morning, I don't even remember what I dreamed about. There are pieces and nuggets of it, but I can't really see it clearly. And so I think we have to help materialize that dream. And I think we can do that by breaking down, barriers to social networks. And that can be achieved through the work of jobs, through business, through
the intersectionality that Fed was talking about.
Right? They all can't do one without the other. They all coexist with each other, which I know is it's daunting to think about, but they do all coexist together.
Yeah, but there's a key to that, and it's intentionality around how we're going to do this work, right? So we have this intersectionality, but if we have intentionality with how we approach it, how we are innovative, how we communicate, I do think that we can move that needle. We are running low on time, and I feel like this is a conversation we could have for another 2 hours, but we made a commitment to make sure that we got to the questions from some of the audience members. And so I'll ask you all to be brief in your answers, but we do want to get to these questions. So Brian, this is directed towards you. Earlier, you talked about the investment in the grassroots organizations. This person asks, what are some of the grassroots organizations that should be scaled up?
And a lot of I on my screen I can see Federico below me, and Federico was on the COVID response fund as well, so I valued his input. There were a number of organizations, and I won't name any because then I'll leave out somebody and offend them. But I will say this is in general terms, there were a couple of buckets that I would highlight. One is organizations that were working with those who lived in motels, which we didn't even know that they were in a fragile situation. So we knew about the homeless and we knew about those in affordable housing. The people who were living sort of week to week in a motel were not really on our radar. And so there were a number of groups who responded to those when they got really hit hard after the COVID crisis. They responded, they knew where they were, they went out and gave them meals, things like that. So that's one I would highlight. I think another is groups that were working with the elderly population, especially those who were having from other countries. They were refugees or immigrants to this country. They weren't used to accessing social services in quite the same way. So there were organizations that we looked at that were working with specific groups from countries or maybe a region like Southeast Asia or something like that, where they were working with them. And those were the other ones where they weren't even really on my radar. And these groups were working very intentionally with them and knew them by name and knew how to reach them. things like that, or other groups were working in mobile home communities,
Mhm.
again, intact. And oftentimes these people were not used to going out and accessing services. So they didn't even know where to go, and they didn't understand how to ask. So they needed people who were culturally competent to go talk to them. So those are, I would say, the groups that were really specialized into sort of marginalized communities were the ones that I really think we ought to lift up, because even though they're small, they are impacting large, significant numbers of people.
Mhm.
That unfortunately, my belief is that maybe we weren't serving them very well. Well, no, I know we weren't serving them very well before the crisis, and so we can't go back to that state. We have to lift up these organizations and make them build capacity.
Small but mighty, right? Because
Exactly.
now you sit here talking about these types of organizations and elevating them even more to have access and to work with other community partners. We had another question. I'm going to direct it to you, Ebony. Are these investments available through competitive grants for nonprofits, or have the groups to receive the funding already been decided?
So this is a 4-year journey, and we are just 6 months into that 4-year journey. So they have not been decided. It is an ongoing evaluation process of opportunities that are either brought to the local market or brought to me and my team to assess. And then, so I think we are doing two things. We're being reactive, meaning those that are incoming to us and making decisions about, does this make sense? Are they connected to the 4 pillars for us, which are health, small business, jobs, and housing? And then reactive, proactive, meaning we can then go out, source opportunities that we think are exciting, contemporary, modern, and we want to have an investment or provide some philanthropic dollars to as well. So it's both reactive and proactive. All grants have not been decided. They will be decided over the next 4 years as those opportunities are presented to us and we seek them.
Fantastic. That gives our organizations here locally the opportunity to be able to have access to those funds, which is the exact purpose for this conversation, right? And so how we can infuse that capital into our Black communities. So we are at that time. It is coming to a close for our conversation. Again, I hate it because I feel like we could talk for another couple of hours. But I want to end with one final question before we say goodbye. And I'll start with you, Federico, and then we'll go to Brian and Ebony. Fed, tell us, what does success look like if we achieve the goals that we've talked about tonight?
That's a great question. I think success can often feel like a moving target. And in truth, success is building deeper relationships, ensuring that we're connecting people across difference, and really building that social network that Brian had mentioned is so thin. Building that out to a robust safety net that can capture people in the midst of a crisis. And that takes us really investing deeply, not only in our community organizations, but also in people, period. And not stopping when we get a no. Intentional about changing the systems that we've become so accustomed to that it's so hard to conceptualize what life would be like if they were different. Just continuing to move forward. So I think success is ever growing, ever evolving, but it's really a connected community that can provide for its needs, that has access to resources and services, that knows how to build out its own social network and provide for itself.
Well, Federico, one thing we know about you is you don't stop when there's a no, and you keep pushing and advocating for our community. We thank you for joining us today on this panel, and we appreciate you being here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Going to you, Brian, questions for you. What does success look like if we achieve these goals?
Well, I'm going to repeat myself a little bit, but to me, what would be amazing is if this place, Charlotte, Mecklenburg County, is the place that other communities, not only in our country, but around the world, look at as the place where we invested in our children and our families and in our people. We made them feel valued, We made them feel a sense of freedom to pursue. We gave them the necessary things. We gave our, not by giving, I mean like it's that we invested in our community and in our people in such a way that they felt empowered to pursue the sort of, like I said, their talents, their passions that they can contribute back to the community. So to me, all of this work ends in the day when every citizen in our community feels a sense of independence and freedom and the desire to go out and pursue those things that they feel very strongly about. But also, I guess ultimately what I would love is that when they feel this sense of freedom, they feel this sense of independence, but they do so with a sense of a community loved them enough, felt a sense of kindness and commitment to them enough that we did this. Not because we did it because, well, this is what we have to do. It's because this community loved every citizen in this community enough, every person in this community enough, that we did these things because we want you to be successful. That's what I ultimately, and I know it's a bit of it's definitely a dream, but it's what I hope and inspire that this work will achieve.
Oftentimes, when things come to fruition, it started as a dream, Brian. And so thank you for your commitment, for the foundation's commitment to the community. And thank you for joining us tonight on this panel.
Thank you, Erin.
Ebony, last but certainly not least, tell us, what does success look like if these goals were achieved?
Wow, this is so amazing because we get to think aspirationally, and quite honestly, Black folks don't always get to be aspirational. We're about basic survival. So I think if I thought aspirationally, I would think that the fragility of all of these gaps and all of these moves forward wouldn't be so fragile, wouldn't be so thin, that we could really make significant progress. That if we looked at any stat, whether it be in health, housing, small business jobs, that we weren't always the one at the bottom, that the community in which we live, we love, we thrive in every day, that the folks that we know that are highly capable, intelligent, they're hungry, they can thrive in any situation, that they have the information they need, they have the access they need, they have the capital they need to really be successful. And so that at the end of the day, the gains that we have made, that quite honestly, this virus wipes away daily, that they wouldn't be so fragile, that we could really make strides, we can really make gains that are long lasting. And we don't always feel like we take a step back to take a step forward. I know that sounds aspirationally. I know that's not rooted in data and stats, but that's just how I feel. And it'd be amazing that if we looked up and, another generation, right? Because it will take another generation, yes, that is what we have achieved, and that we can pinpoint that it started in 2020 when the window of opportunity was open and we took full advantage of that window.
Ebony, you know that being data-driven is very important, but we also need that aspiration. And you have given us the opportunity to end our conversation tonight with an aspirational message of hope that we will work towards achieving. Ebony, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Conversations like this are vital to our community. And the Gantt Center has been a central platform for these discussions to happen and a voice for issues in the Black community, specifically since the start of this pandemic. It is important that we support the continuance of these programs. Consider the ways that you can be of support to the Gantt Center and these initiatives. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to lead us tonight in this conversation. I'll turn it back to you, Afeni, to share the great ways that people can support the Gantt Center and its mission.
Thank you so much, Erin. Thank you for mentioning the importance of the Gantt Center, and thank you for moderating tonight's discussion. The Gantt Center's work to present issues that have affected the Black community on both a local and national scale. Tonight, I'll mention our Text to Give platform as one way you can support us and our mission. by texting Unmasked to 345-345. You can conveniently help us to deepen and expand our reach while including voices that inform and strengthen our awareness for what matters most in our community. As we get near to an eventful year, we want to extend a special thank you to all of you who have supported us throughout the year and supported our virtual programming. Please be sure to tune in next Tuesday, December 15th at 7 p.m. for an open air conversation with the curator and featured artist of our current exhibit, Intersectionality Diaspora Art from the Creole City. We thank you all again for joining us. As always, please be safe and take care. Good night.